First of all, I apologise that I can't be with you all day and I have to go. I've got another speaking engagement at 8 o'clock in Hammersmith. I don't know how I'm going to get there at this time now, but anyway, so I'll keep it fairly brief. First of all, a big thanks to the organisers and all of you. You know, your commitment in being here and the organisers' commitment in putting on this event is really, really important because it does send a signal to people in Russia that we do care about their struggle and we stand in solidarity with them. The big problem coming towards the end is that everybody else who's spoken has made all the really good points. So forgive me if I rehash some of them, but it's a great honour to follow Wendell and others who've spoken today. I guess that we are here, as the slogan says, to send a message to Russia with love. This campaign is not about hate, it's not anti-Russian, it's about love. It's about the positive affirmation of the right of a person to love another person of their choice, regardless of gender or gender identity. It's about the right of Russian people to live in a democratic free society where they can protest and freely express their point of view without the fear of arrest and beating. When we make this celebration of To Russia with Love, we are affirming a universal principle, a principle that applies to every people, in every country, in every culture, in every part of the world. It is all about love, the right to love, the human right of every human being on this planet. But also this campaign is, to some extent, as has already been alluded to, a challenge to hypocrisy. Because we know that there are quite a few people in senior positions in the Russian government who are secretly lesbian, gay, bisexual. I don't know of any trans, but possibly as well. And that is a damning indictment of the contradiction between what they say publicly and what they practice privately. It does signify that, as has been shown in this country with Cardinal Keith O'Brien, the Scottish Catholic Cardinal, so often those who shout the loudest against homosexuality have something to hide. It disguises a repressed, self-hating, self-loathing homophobia, which is a way of disguising or an attempt to disguise their own covert homosexuality or bisexuality. In the case of President Putin, I've got to ask myself, what is it with all this macho, bare-chested horse riding? When you see all those images, not just horse riding, but shooting, fishing, scuba diving, all this ostentatious machismo and professed heterosexuality, it just makes me think the man protests a little bit too much. Perhaps in time we'll discover the truth. Who knows? When it comes to this particular law that's been passed, it is just one of many, many repressive laws that have been passed in Russia over the recent years. The attack upon the LGBT community is symptomatic of a much wider attack on civil society organizations and human rights groups. It would be a very, very big mistake to see the homophobic repression in isolation from the wider repression that's happening in Russian society today. This repression includes the arrest of opposition activists, the violent suppression of peaceful protests, the state control of the media, and the repeated harassment and even violent assaults on lawyers, journalists, and human rights defenders. That's the context of this new anti-gay law and the rising level of homophobic violence. It is very, very important that when we defend LGBT rights, we also defend the human rights of all Russian people, that we work to create an alliance between LGBT and straight Russians for our common defense of liberty, equality, and free expression. With regard to the anti-gay law that's been passed, we all know that apologists for Putin are spreading lies, and there's actually quite a lot of them in this country. quite a lot of them in this country, particularly from people on the so-called left, who will defend the Russian regime on the grounds that it's standing up to the United States. A shocking betrayal of not just LGBT people, but all Russians who are suffering under this tyrannical regime. They make the false claim that this new anti-gay law is solely concerned with protecting minors. As you know, the law prohibits the promotion or propaganda of non-traditional sexual relations to minors, i.e. people under the age of 18. Now, even if this was true, the question to ask is, why do young people need protecting from the reality and truth of same-sex love? This is just a justification, a cover for homophobia. The Russian law, as you know, criminalizes any expression of LGBT identity or any advocacy of LGBT equality where a person under 18 might see it. You don't have to prove that they have seen it, just that they might see it. And it specifically criminalizes anyone who suggests that homosexuality and heterosexuality are equally valid. There's also a clause in this law which specifically says that it is a crime to make any public pronouncement which gives the impression that, quote, homosexuality is attractive or interesting. I mean, this is just phenomenal, extraordinary language, incredibly sweeping in its criminalization. And already we know that people have been arrested for holding LGBT equality signs in public and for publicly saying that homosexuality is normal. To merely say that is now a crime. People have been arrested, even if they've done so without any evidence of a person under 18 having seen these signs. We know of at least 2 examples where there's been absolutely no evidence that a young person under 18 has seen people holding these signs in public, yet those people have been successfully prosecuted and convicted. This new Russian anti-gay law is already preventing young LGBT teens from being told that it's okay to be gay or transgender. It's prohibiting them from being in receipt of HIV prevention information about how to have same-sex relations safely. This is extremely reckless and irresponsible. It's literally putting young Russian LGBT lives at risk. Yet Putin and his allies do not care. They are pressing ahead regardless and defending this law. The other thing that's very noticeable is that the law is quite clearly against the Russian constitution, which guarantees the right to protest and freedom of expression. It's also against the European Convention on Human Rights, which also guarantees the right to protest and freedom of expression, and which Russia has signed and pledged to uphold. You will probably recall that already the European Convention on Human Rights, the European Court on Human Rights, has found Russia guilty of violating the convention by banning and violently breaking up gay pride parades in Moscow, or attempted gay pride parades in Moscow. And already, despite that ruling from the European Court of Human Rights, the Russian courts have banned Moscow gay pride parades for the next 100 years. So quite clearly, the Russian government takes scant regard of those rulings, even though they're quite clearly in contravention of its own commitments and obligations. Like many other people, I went to Moscow 4 times to support the brave, heroic LGBT activists who were trying to hold LGBT pride parades there. And I witnessed firsthand the way in which the police colluded with neo-Nazis, ultranationalists, and right-wing Russian Orthodox leaders in violently attacking those protesters. I myself was a victim in 2007 when I was almost beaten unconscious in full view of the Russian police. They just stood there with folded arms and watched me being dragged to the ground and kicked until I almost lost consciousness. And then I was arrested and my assailants were allowed to walk free. When I was put in the police bus, I saw one of the assailants walk up to the police lines and show some card or some ID to a police officer and being allowed to walk through the police lines. The following year, I saw neo-Nazis and ultranationalists arriving in police buses to attack the protest. And the police pulled back and allowed them to storm into the crowd and attack people left, right and centre. As many of you know, I'm still living with the minor brain and eye injuries that I suffered during the 2007 attack. But many other Russian LGBT activists are also suffering from other injuries that they incurred as a result of police connivance with these extremists. The police themselves, they do handle you roughly, and it's not pleasant, but basically they allow the ultranationalists, the neo-Nazis and the Russian Orthodox fanatics to do their dirty work. They allow them to beat up LGBT activists so they themselves won't be so overtly tainted. And then when you're in the police van or the police station, then you get roughed up by the police when no one's watching. But there have been so many Russian LGBT activists who, despite all these threats and dangers, despite having seen in years previous the violence unleashed and the trumped up charges, still keep going back to protest. I remember on 4 different occasions seeing Russian LGBT activists who, unlike me, won't be on a plane back to London in a couple of days' time. They walked straight into a crowd of 200 or 300 neo-Nazis to affirm their right to march in an LGBT pride parade, to defend the right of LGBT Russians to live in peace and equality. That is just incredible, unbelievable heroism. Because in those neo-Nazi crowds, any one of them could have had a hammer or a knife and stabbed these people to death, and in the surge of the crowd, no one would have known. The fact that Russian LGBT activists who live there 365 days a year are prepared to do this is real, extraordinary heroism. Nothing I've ever done, or most of us in the West have ever done, can compare to the courage, the sheer, absolute courage of these young activists, most of them are very young, under 25, who are prepared to put themselves on the line to fight for their freedom. This is human rights activism of the most noble, inspiring kind. And for us to be able to support them, to show our solidarity, is so, so, so important. I just want to finish by sort of reflecting on what can be done. There's lots of things that can be done. Some of those things are limited. The Russian state is impervious to criticism. Even now, as they arm the Assad government in Syria, despite international condemnation, they just don't care. But it's still worthwhile to email or write to the Russian ambassador, to your MP or MEP, to try and get pressure put on Russia through the European Union, through the British government, through the United Nations. But I think the big thing that's going to impact is trying to get travel bans and asset freezes. These Russians, the people behind this, are mostly very wealthy. They enjoy their freedoms. We need to start curtailing their freedoms as they curtail the freedoms of LGBT and straight Russians. And that means getting international pressure through whatever governments we can to seize their assets, to impose travel bans. They can't come to Britain, for example, to go Christmas shopping at Harrods, to perhaps seize their properties here in London, which many of them have. There is a law that's been passed in the United States, the Magnitsky Act, which is named in honor of Sergei Magnitsky, who was a very brave, heroic human rights defender and journalist who exposed massive corruption in Russia, the literal looting of state assets by the oligarchs, and the way in which the government, the Putin government, is conniving with them. He was eventually arrested, tortured, put in a psychiatric hospital, put in a prison, and eventually murdered by the Russian state. You probably heard that earlier this year, despite him being dead, the corpse was put on trial. That shows you the barefaced, just indignity and inhumanity of this regime. But that act, which was passed in the United States, is a model for similar legislation that could be passed in Britain and many other countries. And right now, Canada is considering a similar law, which would empower the government there to seize the assets of Russian oligarchs and people behind the anti-gay law and other human rights repression, and to impose travel bans on them, so they can no longer freely travel around the world. That, to me, is a really powerful way of really hitting them where it hurts. You know, the boycott Russian vodka is a great idea, but its impact will be marginal. Symbolically, it's really, really important and valuable, but in terms of actually hurting the Russian regime and getting them to change their mind, it ain't going to work. Travel bans and asset freezers, that will really put the wind up them. We need to hit them in the pocket. We also need to ensure that the British government does more to encourage the International Criminal Court to issue indictments and arrest warrants for key Russian human rights abuses. It may be difficult to enforce them, but by issuing those arrest warrants and those indictments, the International Criminal Court will send a signal that these people who've done these terrible things do not have international immunity, that there is a case against them, that they will risk at some point, perhaps when they least expect it, to be seized and taken to The Hague, like Slobodan Milosevic was and Charles Taylor. So those are the kinds of things I think we need to look at in terms of the future. I guess my final point is that, as we all know, LGBT rights are human rights. In a democracy or any country pretending to be a democracy, there is an absolute obligation to ensure that we're all equal before the law, regardless of sexuality or gender identity. And that applies in Britain, in Russia, and everywhere around the world. My final point is, final point, keep dreaming the dream. You know, don't accept the world as it is. Dream of what the world could be, and then help make it happen. Thank you.
Thank you.